I have the great pleasure of hosting Dr. Nick Bostrom. So, Dr. Bostrom, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you for inviting. Happy to be here.
Wonderful. Okay, so I would like to start our discussion with a question on superintelligence. So basically, in 2014, you wrote a book called Superintelligence. So how have your views changed since writing Superintelligence? And are there any ideas or predictions you would adjust today?
I think the timelines have been sort of on the faster end of the distribution. So that's like some kind of contraction of the timelines. I think the most surprising thing to me, I think, is that we have such high-level AI systems that can talk and have a natural conversation quite long before we have the kind of AI that becomes superintelligence. So we have this kind of intermediate stage of rather humanish AIs that was not obvious back in 2014. That you might have thought that sort of the ability to have a general purpose conversation is like a sort of AI complete problem, and that if you could solve that, you would have everything. But it turns out that there is this kind of stepping stone at that level of capability. So that's yeah, and I think that then has as a consequence also the broader awareness of AI, because you have some time to observe AI systems that are quite impressive but not yet super intelligent, which allows the sort of awareness and political actors to get involved more than would have been likely in a sort of very sudden takeoff scenario.
I see. And how optimistic are you that we can align AI systems with human values before encountering catastrophic risks?
Well, I think there is some significant possibility that we will fail to do that. I think if you look at people who are expert on this issue, you have a distribution of opinions from people who are basically fully confident that it's like that this will be solved, up until the other end, people who are so sort of AI doom pilled that their sort of P doom exceeds 1.0 almost. And it seems that a lot of that reflects probably personality more than like different access to evidence or something. I think that this is a kind of portal through which humanity at some point needs to passage. And whilst we might hope that we are gaining increasing insights into alignment that sort of pushes the risk down, the longer we have to work on it, there are also sort of other factors in the background that induce there are background risks, both from other sources, kind of nuclear war, and like also from AI itself, that even current capabilities might unlock different applications in bioweapons and so forth, and just a general sort of social dysfunction. It seems that these kind of collective epistemology systems we have, or maybe like have some risk of making us all go collectively insane in some way. You see the kind of slushing around of public sentiment, and maybe at one point everybody just becomes some mad ideology, as has happened in history, but maybe even more so now when you have global distribution. So I think it would be tragic if we ended up on a path where AI is never developed. And the longer it is postponed, the greater that risk is. So there's like some balance there between not rushing into it before we have at least sufficiently worked on AI safety, but then also not delaying it so long that it never happens. In addition to that, there is a kind of consideration if you actually care about the people who exist, as opposed to just bringing possible people. So like the thing with the currently existing population is that it's dying at a rate of 150,000 people per day. And a much larger set of people have various horrible experiences and ailments and catastrophes short of death. And then obviously in the animal kingdom, it's quite a harsh. So there's like also a sort of moral urgency to try to do this in time to help as many as possible, I think, of people who are currently alive.
I see. And what is your current estimate for when artificial general intelligence might become a reality?
Well, I think we are no longer in a position to confidently exclude even extremely short timelines like a year or two.
Mhm.
Like, I don't think that's likely, but we don't have solid evidence that it couldn't happen in a year or two. Like, it might just be
Mhm.
one breakthrough away, and current systems plus this one, idea might just kind of go all the way. If we imagine just continuing to scale up the current systems, then similarly there are these graphs you could draw that seems to suggest that in the next several
Mhm.
years you might, there could also be a plateauing or barriers that we find, and so there's significant uncertainty around this. But I think that we need to at least take seriously the possibility of a sort of single digit number of years,
Uh-huh.
and then we might be wrong in either direction on that estimate.
Mhm. Yeah, some predictions I've heard, they're saying that we can expect AGI by the age of 2029. Do you think that is correct?
Well, that's one thing that could happen. Um, it does seem many people in the frontier labs have timelines roughly in that ballpark.
Hmm.
Now,
I see.
there might be some selection that you're more likely to sort of end up in a frontier AI lab if you think AI is a big deal and it's going to happen soon. But nevertheless, I
Hmm.
think that is, yeah. So that I mean, it does put a lot of things in perspective. If you assign a significant probability to us being that close to this sort of big change in the whole, you know, kind of complete upending of the game board. And like, if you have kids and stuff and you wonder like what should they learn, it's like if the
Hmm.
actual time when they would put their knowledge to use is like if they're young kids 15, 20 years in the future, you sort of think, wow, by that time probably, like, do
Hmm.
people even need to work? So yeah, there are a lot of ways in which that perspective, to the extent that you place credence on it, is difficult to reconcile with the sort of normal outlook on life that one has.
Hmm. And also, you mentioned a couple of ways that could lead to AGI. And what do you think is the most promising way that might lead us to AGI?
Well, I guess the main line is just sort of continuous scaling up of the current systems and also
Hmm.
applying more compute during runtime. So um, the kind of ChatGPT 1.0 preview that is now out, like, expends additional compute during the computation. So there's like, it's not just a one forward pass, but you have people like AIs that are basically doing thinking. Like the way if I post you a difficult problem, you might not be able to answer it
Hmm.
directly, but you might sit down and think about it and then get a better
Hmm.
answer. And so similarly now, you can sort of deploy the compute not just in training and then do a one forward pass, but kind of do more ratiocination
Hmm.
like the way humans can do. And that's still limited, but you could imagine that, like, with better ways of doing that could unlock things. So
Hmm.
it might be that just doing more of the obvious things, if you do enough more of them, that might get all the way there. But it might also be that there are different clever things in terms of how you structure the representations or the memory
Hmm.
systems or planning, like some extra thing that does the planning, like some combination of those types of things could also create big
Hmm.
unhobblings of the latent capabilities in these large networks.
I see. And how do you think AI researchers are now working on the alignment problem, but the progress is kind of slow? So, what approaches do you think are the key for solving alignment?
Well, I'm not sure whether progress is slow exactly.
Okay.
It might be relatively fast progress, but we don't know how far away the sort of the finish line is. So maybe
Hmm.
people are sprinting quite fast, but we don't know whether it's like a 1 kilometer race or like a 50-kilometer race.
I
Um,
see.
I think, I mean, uh, broadly speaking, the hope is that as these AI systems become sufficiently capable, if they are somewhat aligned at that point, we might then be
Hmm.
able to use their assistance then to sort of align even more capable systems,
Hmm.
and eventually all the way to superintelligence. So that rather than us now figuring out a complete solution that would scale all the way up to sort of planet Jupiter-sized super brains, right? We might just be able to
Yeah.
need to do the next step and then hand over the baton. And we are
Mhm.
already seeing some kind of beginnings of that. Instead of one of the ways that current AI models are sort of aligned is you train a reward model based on
Mhm.
human feedback, and then that reward model can be used to train the actual LLM more.
Right.
And there are other, and then there are like ideas for how to do this in a more sophisticated way via like debate or iterated amplification,
Mhm.
um, and if you sort of get that to work well enough for a sufficiently capable system, then that system might then either initially as a tool to like an adjunct to human, and eventually on its own, then maybe be able to make further progress on alignment.
Right. And now that you have mentioned the reward model, so basically this is connected to reinforcement learning, which is like third paradigm in machine learning. So do you think that reinforcement learning or deep reinforcement learning might be the best way to approach the AGI, since the reinforcement learning is kind of the best imitation of how people learn?
Yeah, so if you have a closed environment like a game or something like that, where you can get the perfect signal, then that seems
Mhm.
to work pretty well for the sort of game playing AIs that we have. Um, Now, of course, if you have very long episodes, like a sort of, like you start a company and then like 2 years later you figure out whether it worked or not, then it's going to be really
Mhm.
hard to collect enough training data to sort of, and so that's why I think part of the reason for my current AI systems are really good at sort of short duration tasks,
Mhm.
and weaker at long duration tasks is because it becomes kind of proportionately harder to A, collect the data, and B, do the credit
Yeah.
assignment if the sort of success happens only after like an hour or a day or a month.
Mhm.
Yeah, it might well be part of it. I mean, for us humans, it's like one of the types of learning that happens. I think like in terms of the number of bits, a lot more goes on unsupervised,
Right.
just learning to recognize the world and stuff like that. But then we do have this sort of reinforcement learning loop on top of that. It
Mhm.
might be important for alignment and such.
Mhm. I see. And how do you see AI shaping humanity's direction over the next century?
Well, and beyond, presumably at that point, if it can shape it for a century, then presumably it can shape it for a million years.
Right.
Um, well, so I have this recent paper, uh, or paper draft, really, called
Mhm.
AI creation and the cosmic host, which suggests that um, there might be sort of layers of um, morality. Like we might have norms, moral norms at
Mhm.
different levels. So like in instead of ordinary common sense morality, you might think, well, you have a certain set of obligations to your family, right? Like special ones you have to take care of, and
Mhm.
then to your friends and local community, maybe a different set, and then as a citizen of your country, you have to like obey the law and just maybe serve in the military, and then like maybe at the global level there's a different level of sort of and then but I think that might be sort of one more layer at least on top of that, which
Mhm.
is a set of moral norms that might exist in this um, set of entities I call the cosmic host. So these might consist of
Mhm.
superintelligence, like advanced extraterrestrial civilizations,
Right.
simulators, traditional deities would also fall into this bracket of sort of super beings. And
Mhm.
if they exist there, they have some sort of set of norms that they have worked out that might become relevant. It might be relevant to us already, and particularly if we are like in the process of maybe creating like a super intelligence that might sort of join the cosmic host in some way. Then I think this
Mhm.
casts an additional beam of light on what we should be aiming for in creating a super intelligence, like not just sort of aligning it to human values and making sure it doesn't kill us. That seems like a good start, but maybe also trying to
Mhm.
make it such that it becomes a good cosmic citizen, that it sort of plays well in this larger context. And
Mhm.
we might have various reasons for doing that, both moral
Mhm.
and prudential.
I see. And are there any particular technologies that, besides AI, that you would think will most significantly define our future?
Well, AI is kind of bleeding into most other technologies
Mm-hmm.
currently, right? So I expect that to
Mm-hmm.
continue. I think no, there are a few areas if we are looking at potential existential risks. I think biotechnology could be a source of existential risk. Would have happened anyway with advances in synthetic
Mm-hmm.
biology. Obviously, AI that allows us to do more, you know, easy molecular modeling and design could accelerate that. So that's one
Mm-hmm.
particular focus area. Um, Autonomous weapon systems is another that could sort of transform warfare, and we're like in very early stage ways already seeing that a little bit in Ukraine. But
Mm-hmm.
so far, most of these systems are sort of human control, like it's a remote operator. Like, but that the next level will be that they are able to, because then you might lose the radio. The enemy might jam the radio signal. The drone is worthless. Like,
Mm-hmm.
so, if it had a little chip on board that could recognize soldiers as they're running around and then target them, then you have sort of more autonomous.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Also, like I think our sort of social epistemology, um, where we all have we know historically that changes in our information technology can make big differences. The invention of writing
Mm-hmm.
seems to have been a major factor enabling the creation of states with like
Right.
central administration and taxation systems, and then standing armies and large scale war and economic,
Mm-hmm.
like all kinds of positive and negative. Then again with the printing press, right, we had like 30 years wars in Europe and Reformation, and we
Mm-hmm.
had the rise of science later on, etc. um, then mass media, some people implicate that in the rise of totalitarianism, like the kind of radio
Right.
broadcast to the nation, and as well as hugely positive effects as well. But we are like now in a kind of another information revolution. First with the internet,
Mm-hmm.
then social media, and now sort of AI empowered social companion bots, more sophisticated abilities to filter, censor, maybe create bespoke propaganda materials.
Mm-hmm.
We just don't know really how that shakes out. It could, if we are fortunate, the sort of the positive applications outweigh the negative, and we become much more informed and able to reason together with our AI reasoning assistants and fact finders.
I see.
But it's also
Mm-hmm.
possible it goes off the rails in some way that is hard for anybody to stop, and
Mm-hmm.
it becomes easier for some sort of crazy meme to take hold and then just run across the population rather than being a small little cult with 300 people.
Yeah.
Like now, maybe you have like a cult with 3 billion people who are like
Mm-hmm.
monitoring each other's every communication through automated AI orthodoxy sensors and stuff like that. And so that
Mm-hmm.
I think we are kind of in choppy waters, and are probably going to remain in quite choppy waters until, for better or worse, this AI transition happens. So we don't want to
Right.
remain it too long, because I think like forever we take some sort of uh, risk panel for every year or decade that we last in this kind of turbulent condition. Like at some point we
Mm-hmm.
might run on aground, or like
Mm-hmm.
a sea monster like comes up with a tentacle and submerges us, or something else like that. So um,
I see.
there's like a background level of existential risk that I think is unusually high at this current level of history, just because so
Mm-hmm.
much is changing. Like, in the year, 4000 BC, like, I mean, it wasn't that different from 4500 BC or 3500
Mm-hmm.
BC. So 500
Yeah.
years, 1000 years could pass without much. Now it seems like every few years there's like, it's almost a different world out there, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And when we are talking about AI safety, what kind of international coordination is needed to ensure that AI development is pursued safely? So, what are the biggest obstacles standing in the way of this coordination?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. I think it will become AI
Mm-hmm.
increasingly entangled in geopolitics. I think it would obviously be
Mm-hmm.
optimal if one could have a more internationally cooperative approach to this.
Yeah.
Um, um, but there are people and interests who kind of thrive from conflict, and it gives more funding and resources to various kind of
Mm-hmm.
military security thing, and it can be hard to sort of negotiate your way out of that if there is like a history of distrust. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so the most likely thing, I guess, is that the world's superpowers will race to develop advanced AI, and then others will either just be irrelevant, or in some cases, maybe if they have become sufficiently strategically aware, try to ally themselves with one or the other of the superpowers to sort of be in on it in some way.
Right.
And I think the strongest negotiating power, like that other countries have, might be now before it's very obvious who will win or what resources will be needed, where the sort of supply chain is still fairly distributed, like the chip supply chain has a lot of countries that are needed for that, and there are like some areas that have big consumer markets. There are others that have various other sources of leverage or power or raw material, and so now would be maybe a good time to try to come to some agreement about like ultimately AI being for the like the common good of all.
Yeah.
And then there might need to be more specific agreements as particular risks come into view, like if there are particular sort of risks from open sourcing models that could enable bioweapons to be produced, then there might be some sort of tailored agreement to not do that. Just as we have, even amongst competing nations, we have various kind of arms limitation agreements and various other treaties that help, at least on the margin, limit the sort of the harm of kind of completely unconstrained rivalry.
I see. And do you believe that there are natural limits to the technological progress in that humanity might encounter, or do you believe that the possibility of indefinite advancement?
Well, I think there are ultimate limits. It's just that I think there are quite high, and so there's a lot of sort of headroom between where we are now and the ultimate maximum. And we might never exactly reach the maximum, but what I imagine is that you would eventually asymptote to it, where like each year has smaller and smaller unit. And I think like that would come after we have superintelligence that then does this sort of builds up some sort of ideal nanomolecular design for whatever most things you want to build, like how to make the perfect Dyson sphere, how to make the sort of von Neumann probe that can go out on a planet and unfold some infrastructure and build computronium, maybe like matter optimized for performing computation. And then like that, it kind of forms the base level of civilization, like the equivalent of sort of mining and energy production and transportation and electric nets and train networks today. Like, and then on top of that, then it depends on the values of the civilization, what all of this infrastructure is used for. And it might be that certain values would allow for sort of a more or less indefinite further stream of progress, to the extent that you have these kind of moving targets, like fashion cycles, right? They kind of almost intrinsically are set up so as to keep changing. And if you have that sort of you have a treadmill effect where you can never achieve the ultimate state where you can rest, because there is like you value change itself. Or you could imagine increasing the sophisticated forms of social production, not just prove this theorem, but then when you've proven that, like prove a more difficult theorem, or build like one piece of art, but then that changes culture. Now you try to create some other form of art that sort of encompasses the way that culture initially dealt with this initial piece of art, and you could then kind of maybe have some more indefinitely cumulative form of progress, even as the base layer becomes kind of reaches some sort of near optimal and not really further improving state.
And how do you think the increasing acceptance of simulation argument impact humanity's perspective on ethics and existential risks?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so far my impression is it has not yet had a big impact on most people. It's not sunk in, I think, and also partly because there is a lot of uncertainty and ignorance. We are not really sure, even if you accept the simulation hypothesis, like what then follows precisely is not at all clear. And so if like it makes sense to default to what you were doing before, until and unless you have more specific implications coming from it, right? And I think we need to be humble about our ability to understand this full picture. That's like one implication, just to be a little bit more a sense of humility and in front of the great. But I think this what I alluded to earlier, this thing, the AI creation and the cosmic host might be a sort of a little a hint at one direction, some kind of gesture, some implications it might have, where we might, when creating our own superintelligence, maybe we shouldn't just think of it very narrowly as to here is this AI,
Mm-hmm.
here are we humans on Earth, and this is basically all there is, and we need to make sure we control it. But really, we're sort of introducing something into this much larger context that we already
Mm-hmm.
exist in, although we are kind of fairly oblivious to most of it.
Right.
And when you think of that, it's like, yeah, maybe more like, yeah, raise a good cosmic citizen, or at least that would be one of the sort of objectives in this effort.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I do think that it's a little unclear exactly what concretely that means we should do differently, but I do think it creates a different perspective from which, and
I
one
see.
comes at this with a greater sense of humility. Like, we are small here. This is a big thing. It's existed long before us. There are much greater beings out there.
Mm-hmm.
We are doing this thing. We don't really know what we are doing very well. Let's, you know, let's approach this with a sense of humility and try to, hopefully it will be good for us as well. But there are larger um,
Mm-hmm.
interests at stake potentially.
Right. And if we were to encounter extraterrestrial intelligence, how should we approach their moral frameworks relative to our own?
Well, I mean, I think, well, so it depends a lot, I guess, on what kind of extraterrestrial civilization, what stage of development they were. Is it like some sort of
Mm-hmm.
super intelligence that arrives at the speed of light to our planet? And then I think it, mostly depends on their decisions, what happens.
I see.
If we're imagining encountering kind of some more equals, then I mean, we would hope that we have learned a little bit from history, because we've had these kind of analogous situations on Earth, like where like a more technologically advanced civilization has come into contact with a more technologically
Mm-hmm.
primitive, and often now, at least from our current moral vantage point, it's kind of ended in kind of a genocide or of different
Yeah.
of different forms of that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's very important that uh, we develop sort of cooperative norms and frameworks that can accommodate even civilizations and beings with very different interests. So
Mm-hmm.
I would hope that even if we encounter, say, like a paperclip maximizing civilization, like this is the classic example in AI safety, right? An on-the-line AI that just wants to make paperclips and
Mm-hmm.
then takes over
Right.
the world. Like, if we came and there was this paperclip, I'm hoping that we would be able to find some way to look for Pareto improvements that would,
Mm-hmm.
rather than sort of fight to the death, find some way to um, harmoniously coexist. And for many values, that would be possible, I think. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and even if we were in control, like even if we had the power over this paper clipper, I would hope that we would be looking for ways in which it could at least get to make some paper clips, and and to have this more kind of cosmopolitan mindset, because I think ultimately it's a big world out there, and it's like really maybe the only hope that it all hangs together in some positive way is if there's
Mm-hmm.
this kind of if love prevails over narrow hatred at the highest levels. And to the
I
extent
see.
that, I mean, it's, to a large extent out of our, but to the extent that we have any say in that we are a little part of the whole, and like maybe the way we choose to behave kind of reflects
Mm-hmm.
on or is correlated with the way other parts behave. And so um, choosing to play nice in that context might improve our odds that the world as a whole will
Mm-hmm.
turn out to be that way.
Right. And can you elaborate on your vision of a post-human future?
Well, in the good scenario, I think we will achieve two things. One is the ability to get rid of horrible negatives that currently plague the human condition, and we don't need to dwell on
Mm-hmm.
them, but they are very, like I say, hugely urgent and important to sort of mitigate all the suffering that exists around. And that it's easy to forget if you're like, you're relatively young, healthy, well-fed, sitting in a nice warm room, doing something you're interested in. Like, that's a little bubble in this world. If you look around, that the
Mm-hmm.
hospices and the war zones and the poor country. Like there's a lot of so getting rid of that. But then on top of that, the unlocking of something, the path to potentially much more wonderful forms of human existence, even than human
Mm-hmm.
existence at its current best. Um,
Right.
and I think there are various dimensions we can sort of point to. So like the kind of the duration of healthy lifespan is one. You could
Mm-hmm.
imagine various forms of upgrades of our consciousness and awareness and cognitive abilities, and then also improvements in our emotional capacities to take joy in and appreciate and relate to other people and the world around us. I think there's a huge space there that the once you sort of are able to eventually remove some of our current biological limitations, and
Mm-hmm.
I think there are extremely wonderful modes of being out there in this space of possibilities that I would hope
I
in the
see.
fullness of time we would be able to sort of grow into. I think of it now almost like it would be tragic if a child died, but it would also be tragic if maybe a child never grew up, like if they were sort of
Mm-hmm.
stymied to never reach, like even if they had somehow the. And I think similarly we are all kind of like these children, every human who has never really had a chance to fully grow up. I don't think you can
Mm-hmm.
sort of grow up in 80 years or like fully, like it's just at the very beginners, the toddler stage really of. And so if we could continue to sort of develop emotionally, intellectually, live healthily for much longer, and then maybe grow our minds, that would be sort of levels of maturity, and that we might attain that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
um, and so I wrote this recent book, Deep Utopia, on some of the kind of philosophical challenges when you really start to think seriously about what it would mean to live in this kind of solved world, like where the AIs can do everything better than we can do, and all practical problems,
Mm-hmm.
you just press the button on your AI. So how do we find kind of, what's the best possible trajectory for somebody starting with the kind of life we have today, and then eventually leading into this maybe posthuman, maybe eventually radically posthuman, but like enjoying
Mm-hmm.
like stopping to smell the flowers along the way, like maybe
Yeah.
rather than instantly transforming yourself into this planetary super being, right? Maybe kind of, each year, instead of getting sort of weaker and dumber, and your eyesight is reduced every year, like everything just gets worse after a certain point in life.
Mm-hmm.
Like what if it went the other way around? Like each year you got a little, yeah, you just kept going like you do from age 10 to age 18, and then it like um yeah, and but then how we find sort of meaning and purpose and interesting things to
Mm-hmm.
do in this whole world is a kind of an interesting and non-trivial philosophical challenge.
Right. And when we are talking about transhumanism, what should we balance? How should we balance the promise of enhancement technologies with the ethical concerns?
Yeah, I'm not sure what balance, like, so in terms of the ideal, we are looking to actually benefit
Mm-hmm.
humans. So like if
Yeah.
now there are ways in which there are ethical complications arising there. So for example,
Mm-hmm.
there is the question of paternalism, which is not unique to human enhancement, but like if somebody
Mm-hmm.
refuses a medical treatment that would save their life,
Yeah.
normally we think people have a right to do that if they're, at least if they're sort of adults and they are mentally competent. But
Mm-hmm.
sometimes maybe somebody needs some anti psychotic drug for their own good to not commit suicide, or like children, obviously we feel uh, we need to try to help them uh, not do totally dumb things that wreck their whole future for young children. And
Right.
so it's like the question like that, like you could imagine a future where some people just don't want to enhance themselves and other people think it would be better if they were enhanced. I think I would tend to lean towards a morphological freedom there, like within a very large compass, at least giving respecting
Mm-hmm.
people's choices. Um, there are these zero sum or negative sum enhancements, like in athletics. Doping is maybe one of those, that it makes you more likely to win, but it also makes somebody else less likely to win by exactly the same amount. And so if everybody takes these anabolic steroids, you just
Mm-hmm.
get everybody have the negative health effects. right? And nobody competitively would be better off than if nobody took them. So that could be there are many positional goods that humans pursue, that would have no sort of net social benefit if everybody were enhanced in those ways. And there you can
And
have an ethical
yeah,
case that those should be discouraged.
I see. And also one transhumanist idea is the potential for mind uploading. So do you
Yeah.
think this is realistic?
I think it is an affordance at technological maturity to do this, to take some mind initially implemented organically in a brain, and then scanning the connectome of that and creating a sufficiently detailed and accurate emulation of that in a digital substrate that would then capture the personality, the memories. I think in some situations, at least, it would actually be you if that procedure was performed well. And you might, for the same reason, you might now care about you tomorrow and you a year from now. Similarly,
Yeah.
if you were to be uploaded, you might have now reason to care about what happens to this upload and sort of think of that as a form of survival.
And
And
also,
it would then unlock a lot of
yeah.
things. Like a lot of things become a lot easier to do once you're uploaded, right? You have like things that maybe you could try to keep like the human body and the human brain safe from various accidents and stuff. Like it's a lot easier if you can make backup copies. Obviously easier to enhance and add, insert extra neurons in these cortical areas, and you just have much more sort of easy technological control. Although I think with mature technology, you probably could do quite a lot also with just sort of super advanced biotechnology.
Right. And how, I mean, could you explain the observation selection effect to a complete layman?
Well, this is a piece of sort of probability theory reasoning where there are different ways of thinking about it, but basically you might so like a simple version of it might be if we look back on impact craters on Earth. Like there's like meteors and asteroids strike the Earth every once in a while. They come in different sizes, and we could sort of see over time the size of these impact craters and estimate the distribution. Like how often do you get an impact of a given size? And then if a civilization does that, like imagine there are many planets with different human-like people out in the universe. What they will never see as they look back in their historical record is that a really big crater has happened very recently, right? Because then they wouldn't be there to observe. And so like a moderately big one recently, or a really huge one slightly longer ago, or an enormous one even longer ago, they're sort of ruled out by this observation selection effect. These types of data would be inconsistent with the subsequent existence of some observer to have the data. And so then when we make inferences from observing the actual distribution of these craters on Earth, like to how many asteroids are there out there and how often will they impact the Earth in the future, we need to take this observation selection effect into account. Like we can't observe just from the fact that there wasn't a recent sort of dinosaur killer that those are infrequent. And so you need to try to correct for that kind of observation selection effect. And they come up in many different contexts. There are philosophical thought experiments like the Sleeping Beauty experiment. They come up in when like in the context of the search for extraterrestrial life, or you're thinking about the origins of life. How likely is it that there is other extraterrestrials? In quantum physics, in the interpretation of quantum mechanics, they come up in this many worlds context, and in various other situations. And the exact way of reasoning about this is still something that is not fully settled yet. It sort of is quite you can define various principles on how to reason, but it seems that for each set of principle that has been proposed, they have certain paradoxes or counterintuitive implications if you sort of apply them consistently.
I see. And how do you maintain your optimism while working on the topics that often highlight humans' vulnerabilities?
Well, I guess you're to some extent, I think we kind of equilibrate to a natural level of expectations. Like if something turns out to be worse than you thought, you get sad. If something turns out to be better than you thought, you get happy. But after a while, it sort of tends to revert to some sort of personality baseline, probably to a significant extent. So that's maybe is part of the reason. But then also, I think I say as long as there is ignorance, there is hope, and there is still a lot of ignorance. So in that ignorance, there is the possibility of it could be better than we think as well, and it could be really wonderful. In fact, it does seem that is a sort of possibility that is definitely not excluded by present evidence. And so that's and then for the most part, I guess on a day-to-day basis, you also are maybe more focused on the specific task at hand, the specific problem you're trying to solve, the question you answer. Like you have to sort of a lot of the time focus on the next step if you're gonna get anywhere. You like, as a philosopher, you definitely want to stand back and just look at the whole thing, right? Take it in, where are we going, right? But you also need to sort of be practical, and so that then focuses the mind on more concrete, tangible, analytic little bits that don't have the same maybe emotional load.
I see. And the final question. So, if you could send one key message to humanity in 100 years from now, what would it be?
Well, I mean, I guess I could send that. Like, I mean, if I just write something that doesn't get deleted, it's so I mean, I don't know. Best wishes, Nick. I don't know. It's I think like that they in some sense they are in our hands. Like maybe we are also in their hands through sort of simulation possibilities, but also like whether they even exist, and if so, in what form they exist, or which ones. It's not really that there's like one set of future people that will either exist or not exist, but like presumably depending not just on our choices, but on just random little stochastic events, like whether you cough 3 minutes from now might well mean that a totally different set of people exist 100 years from now through this kind of chaotic systems, right? Like, so your cough triggers a little swirl in the air in the room that 2 years later means there is now a rainstorm somewhere where there wouldn't have been otherwise. So somebody stays inside, and then they don't go out to this coffee shop where they would have met their spouse, and then like I do think it's quite likely that there is this kind of chaoticity in the sense that tiny perturbations of the initial conditions now will, if you scroll forward 100 years, result in a very different set of people existing, unless current existing people still are there, but like new people are, because there's like such sensitive dependence on the exact initial conditions of which combinations of genetic materials are. So they're like different futures that will with different people. And maybe we have some. It is striking that if this picture is even vaguely correct, like it like the naive picture of the world is like that we are near this fulcrum of history where these massively consequential events will unfold within the lifetime of many people alive today that might shape the future for millions, and maybe the galaxy or the light cone. And it is kind of weird coming back to this anthropic observation selection effect stuff. It would maybe be surprising if that picture were correct, that you should then find yourself amongst this tiny minority of people who exist right next to this giant lever of history. Like, as opposed to all the people in the past or the much greater number of people who will exist in the future. Like, why should you, if you think of yourself as sort of a randomly selected person from all the people that will ever exist, then why should you be right? That is a kind of suspicious, a reason, I think, to be a little bit suspicious of the correctness of this naive picture.
I see. Wonderful. So, Dr. Bostrom, I would like to thank you for this truly wonderful conversation, and I would also like to thank you for your time and for doing this podcast.
Well, nice to speak to you.
Thank you.
All right.